The dust had not yet settled from the drought when Maude Wilcox heard the sound that every rancher in the Arizona Territory dreaded most, the creak of a debt collector's wagon rolling up the dry road toward her gate. It was the summer of 1883, and the land around Tanner's Creek had gone 3 months without a drop of rain. Maude had watched her cattle grow thin, had watched the creek that gave the place its name shrink down to a muddy trickle, and had prayed more nights than she could count that the sky would open up and save what her late husband had built. Thomas Wilcox had died 2 years prior, thrown from his horse while chasing a stray steer through a ravine, and since that day Maude had run the ranch alone with nothing but grit, an aging foreman named Silas, and a stubbornness that the whole county had come to respect, even if they whispered about it behind her back. The rain had finally come 3 weeks earlier, a hard driving storm that filled the creek and turned the brown hills green again. Maude had stood on her porch and wept with relief, watching the water pool in the low places of her land, knowing that her herd would survive the winter after all. She thought in that moment that the worst was behind her. She was wrong. The wagon that rolled up now belonged to a man named Wendell Pratt, a debt collector out of Prescott who worked for the Territorial Bank and Trust. He was a thin man with small eyes and a mustache waxed to 2 sharp points, and he rode with 2 hired men who carried themselves like they had done this sort of work before, and did not much mind the doing of it. Maude stepped off the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her chin lifted the way her mother had taught her to hold it when trouble came calling. "Mr. Pratt," she said, "I was not expecting you until the end of the month." "Circumstances have changed, Mrs. Wilcox." Pratt did not dismount. He sat his horse and looked down at her the way a man looks at a debt rather than a person. "The bank has called in the note early, effective immediately. That cannot be legal. Thomas signed a note for the full season. We are not due until October. The note has a clause, ma'am, regarding the health of the herd and the condition of the land. Given the drought, the bank has determined the collateral to be insufficient and has exercised its right to call the debt in full." Maude felt the ground shift beneath her, though the drought had broken and her herd stood fat and healthy in the north pasture at that very moment. "The drought is over, Mr. Pratt. Look around you. My cattle are fine. My grass is green." "That may be so, ma'am, but the paperwork was filed before the rains came, and the bank does not undo paperwork on account of weather. I have been sent to collect $420, or to begin proceedings to take the ranch in lieu of payment." $420. Maude did not have $40, let alone 10 times that. She had spent every cent she had keeping her cattle alive through the dry months, buying feed hauled in from as far as Flagstaff, paying men to dig deeper wells that had come up dry more often than not. "I need time," she said, and hated the way her voice shook on the words. "You have 7 days, Mrs. Wilcox. I will return on the 7th day, and if the debt is not settled, I will have the sheriff and a writ of eviction with me." Pratt tipped his hat, the gesture somehow more insulting than if he had not bothered at all, and turned his horse back down the road, his 2 hired men following. Maude stood in the yard for a long while after they had gone, watching the dust of their passing settle back onto the earth, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time since Thomas had died, allowed herself to cry. It was Silas who found her there an hour later, and it was Silas who suggested, gently, that she might ride into town and speak with Micah Keene. "Keene," Maude repeated, wiping her eyes. "The horse trader. He is more than a horse trader now, ma'am. Word is he has done well for himself these past years, bought up some land east of town, got himself a reputation as a fair man in dealings. He might know something of banking men, or might know a way to buy you time. Cannot hurt to ask." Maude had met Micah Keene exactly twice before, both times at church socials, both times with nothing more than polite words exchanged between them. He was a broad-shouldered man in his middle 30s, quiet in the way that made people wonder what he was thinking, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of good, strong coffee. She remembered that he had helped her carry a table once, at a social 2 summers past, and that he had tipped his hat to her at Thomas's funeral, standing at the back of the small crowd, though she did not recall inviting him nor knowing him well enough to expect his presence. She did not know if he would help her now. A widow he barely knew, but she was out of other ideas, and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The next morning she rode into the town of Cottonwood Bend, a modest collection of buildings strung along a single dusty street, and asked after Micah Keene at the Mercantile. The shopkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Abernathy, pointed her toward the livery at the edge of town. Maude found him there, sleeves rolled to his elbows, working a hot shoe onto the hoof of a bay gelding with the easy patience of a man who had done the task 1,000 times. He looked up when her shadow fell across the doorway, and something in his coffee-colored eyes shifted, some recognition or surprise she could not quite name. Mrs. Wilcox. He set down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag hanging from his belt. This is unexpected. Mr. Keene, I am sorry to trouble you. I would not have come if I had any other choice. She had rehearsed the words on the ride-in, but they still felt clumsy in her mouth, standing there in the dim light of the livery with the smell of hot iron and horse sweat around her. You are no trouble at all, ma'am. What can I do for you? She told him everything, the drought, the note, the debt collector Pratt, the 7 days she had been given. Micah listened without interrupting, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression growing darker as she spoke. $420 is a hard sum to raise in 7 days, he said when she had finished, especially with the banks in Prescott the way they are. They have been squeezing ranchers all through this territory since the railroad men started buying up land options. I have heard tell of at least 3 other outfits forced to sell for less than they were worth this past year alone. Then you understand why I came to you. Silas said you might know a way, or know men who could lend against my herd until I can pay it back proper. Micah was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in a way that made her feel oddly exposed, though there was nothing improper in his gaze, only a kind of careful consideration. I have some savings, he said finally. Not $420 worth, but a fair piece of it. And I know a few men in town who might be persuaded to put in the rest if I vouch for the debt myself. I could not ask that of you, Mr. Keene. You do not even know me. I knew Thomas some. Good man. Fair in his dealings, which is more than I can say for most in this territory these days. He picked his tools back up, though he did not return to the shoe just yet. And I have watched you keep that ranch running these 2 years past, alone, when most folks figured you would sell out within the first season. That tells a man something about a person's character. Maude felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to such directness, unused too to the strange warmth that spread through her chest at his words. I do not know what to say except thank you, but I do not want charity, Mr. Keene. Whatever you and your friends might lend, I intend to pay back every cent with fair interest. I would expect nothing less from you, ma'am. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen from him, and it changed his whole face, softened the hard lines of his jaw. Give me 2 days. Let me see what I can gather. In the meantime, you might want to speak with a lawyer about that clause in your note. Sounds to me like the bank is stretching the truth of it to suit their own purposes, and there may be recourse in that. She rode home that afternoon with something she had not felt in longer than she cared to admit, a small flickering hope, and beneath it, though she was reluctant to name it even to herself, something else entirely, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun beating down upon her shoulders. Micah Keene, for his part, found himself distracted from his work for the rest of that day, his mind returning again and again to the image of Maude Wilcox standing in the doorway of his livery, her chin lifted despite the fear he could see plain in her eyes, asking for help but never once begging for it. He had admired her from a distance for 2 years now, had told himself it was merely respect for a woman managing hardship with dignity. But standing close to her that morning, close enough to see the small lines of worry at the corners of her eyes and the strands of dark hair that had escaped her braid to curl against her neck. He had felt something shift inside his chest that was considerably less simple than respect. He was 36 years old, a widower himself these past 4 years, his wife Sarah having succumbed to a fever during the influenza that had swept through the territory in the winter of 1879. He had told himself in the years since that he had made his peace with solitude, that a man could build a good life without a wife beside him, and for the most part he had believed it. But something about Maude Wilcox, about the particular set of her shoulders and the steadiness of her voice even when speaking of ruin, had cracked open a door in him that he had thought long since sealed shut. He spent that evening and the next calling on men he trusted around Cottonwood Bend, men who owed him favors or who simply respected his judgment enough to take his word on a matter. There was Jedediah Snow, who ran the general store and had $50 he was willing to part with. There was Otis Faraday, a cattle buyer passing through who, upon hearing the particulars, offered another $60 on the promise of first pick of Maude's herd come selling season, a fair enough trade that Maude would later agree to without complaint. There was the town's one lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Elias Thorne, who upon hearing Maude's situation, agreed to review her note without charging his usual fee, muttering something about the Territorial Bank and Trust needing a lesson in honest dealing. By the end of the second day, Micah had gathered $310, his own savings making up a full $150 of that sum, more than a third of what he had put by over the better part of a decade. It was not the full amount, but it was close, closer than Maude could have imagined possible, and when he rode out to her ranch that evening to tell her the news, he found her in the north pasture, checking on a calf that had gotten itself tangled in a stand of brush. She looked up at the sound of his horse, and something in her face, some tired hopelessness that had settled there since Pratt's visit, lifted at the sight of him. "Mr. Keene." "I have $310 for you, Mrs. Wilcox. It is not the full sum, but Elias Thorne has been looking over your note, and he believes there may be grounds to challenge the bank's timing of the call. If nothing else, it might buy us more time to raise the rest." Maude set down the rope she had been using to free the calf and crossed the pasture toward him, her boots sinking slightly into the mud left behind by the recent rains. "I do not know how to thank you for this." "You do not need to thank me. Just pay it back when you are able, and maybe, someday, do the same for some other soul in need. That is how a community ought to work if you ask me." She stood close enough now that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, catching the last light of the setting sun, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them thick with something unnamed. "Would you care to stay for supper, Mr. Keene? It is only beans and cornbread, but you have ridden a long way, and I would like the chance to properly thank you, even if you insist it is not necessary." "I would like that very much, Mrs. Wilcox." Supper that evening was a quiet affair, Silas joining them at the table, speaking little but watching the two of them with the sharp attention of an old man who had seen enough of the world to recognize the beginnings of something when it started to bloom. Maude found herself talking more freely than she had in months, telling Micah about Thomas, about the early days of the ranch, about her hopes for expanding the herd once the debt was settled and the drought fully behind them. Micah listened with genuine interest, offering his own stories in turn, of his own wife Sarah, of the loneliness of the years since her passing, of the livery business he had built up from nothing after deciding that horse trading suited him better than the mining work that had first brought him to the territory. "Sarah would have liked you," he said at one point, and then seemed surprised at his own words, as though he had not meant to say them aloud. Maude felt her heart stumble oddly in her chest. "That is a kind thing to say. I mean it. She had a way of seeing straight through to a person's character, same as you seem to do. I imagine the two of you would have gotten on well." After supper, Micah lingered on the porch while Silas retired to the bunkhouse, and Maude walked him out to where he had tied his horse near the water trough. The night had cooled considerably, The desert sky spread wide and bright with stars, the kind of clear, brilliant sky that only came after a good hard rain had washed the dust from the air. "I meant what I said about paying you back," Maude said, standing close beside him in the dark. "Every cent, Mr. Keene. I know you did." He looked down at her, and there was something in his gaze now that made her breath catch, something warm and searching. "Maude." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sent a small shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. "I hope you will not think me forward for saying so, but I have thought of you often these past 2 years, more often than I have let myself admit. Micah." She tried his name too, found it fit comfortably in her mouth. "I have thought of you as well, though I would not have admitted it either until now." He reached out slowly and took her hand in his palm calloused and warm against her own. "I do not want to rush you or presume too much, given all you have on your shoulders right now. But I would like your permission to call on you properly once this business with the debt is settled. You have my permission now, Micah Keene. I see no reason to wait." He smiled then, the same smile that had transformed his face in the livery 2 days before, and leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to step back if she wished it. She did not step back. His lips brushed hers, gentle and questioning, and she answered by leaning into him, one hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart beating fast beneath her palm. When they finally parted, both of them slightly breathless, Micah rested his forehead against hers for a long moment. "I will find the rest of that money," he murmured. "I do not know how yet, but I will find it. I will not let that man take this ranch from you." "We will find it together," Maude said. "I still have 3 days. I can sell some of the herd early, take a loss on the price, but raise enough to close the gap. Then let us start at first light." He rode home that night with his heart fuller than it had been in 4 long years, and Maude lay awake long past midnight, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she had once shared with Thomas, feeling both the ache of old grief and the strange, bright wonder of new hope, and finding that the two feelings, rather than fighting each other, seemed instead to settle together into something like peace. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Maude and Silas worked from dawn until dusk, separating out a portion of the herd that could be sold, without crippling the ranch's future breeding stock, 20 head of healthy young steers that the recent rains had fattened up nicely. Micah rode out each morning to help, bringing with him 2 ranch hands he trusted from his own small spread east of town, and together they drove the selected cattle toward Cottonwood Bend, where Otis Faraday, true to his earlier offer, agreed to buy the lot at a fair price, $85, enough to nearly close the remaining gap when combined with the 310 Micah had already gathered. It was on the 5th day, with the debt collector Pratt due to return in 2 days' time, that Elias Thorne rode out to the ranch with news that made Maude's heart leap. "I have reviewed the note carefully, Mrs. Wilcox," Thorne said, standing in her kitchen with the document spread across the table between them. "The clause the bank is citing refers specifically to sustained drought conditions affecting the collateral's value at the time of assessment, but the assessment date listed here is 3 weeks past, which was indeed during the drought. However, the note also stipulates that the bank must provide 30 days written notice before calling in the debt early, and Mr. Pratt provided you only 7. Then the call itself may be invalid." "I believe so, yes. I intend to file a formal objection with the territorial court in Prescott, and I have also taken the liberty of writing to the bank's regional office directly, informing them of the procedural error. It will not resolve things overnight, but it should, at minimum, buy you considerably more time and may void the early call altogether." Maude sank into a chair, relief washing through her so profoundly that her hands trembled. "Mr. Thorne, I do not know how to repay you for this." "Think nothing of it, Mrs. Wilcox. Micah Keene is a good friend, and it does my heart good to see the Territorial Bank and Trust answer for their sharp practices for once. They have run roughshod over enough small ranchers in this territory, and it is high time someone called them to account. When Micah arrived later that afternoon, having heard the news from Thorne on his way through town, he found Maude sitting on her porch step, staring out at the pasture where her herd grazed peacefully in the golden afternoon light, looking lighter than he had ever seen her. "You have heard, then," she said, as he climbed the steps to sit beside her. "I have. Thorne is a good man." "I always said so. We may not even need the full amount now if the call itself is invalid. Perhaps not. But I would still like you to have it, Maude, regardless of how things settle with the bank. Consider it insurance against whatever else this territory might throw at you." He paused, then added, more quietly, "Consider it a gift from a man who has come to care for you a great deal, and who would like the chance to prove it in whatever ways you will allow." Maude turned to look at him, and found herself smiling in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar after so many months of worry, a smile that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. "I would allow quite a lot, Micah Keene, if you are asking. I am asking." He kissed her again there on the porch step, slower this time, less questioning and more certain, and when they finally pulled apart, Maude rested her head against his shoulder and watched the sun sink lower toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet that seemed, to her eyes at least, more beautiful than any sunset she could remember. But their peace was not to last uninterrupted. 2 days later, precisely as promised, Wendell Pratt returned to the Wilcox ranch, this time accompanied not only by his 2 hired men, but by the county sheriff, a heavy-set man named Hollis Bragg who had a reputation for siding with whoever paid him the most attention, which in this case appeared to be the bank. Maude and Micah were both in the yard when the small procession arrived, having spent the morning mending a section of fence that had washed out in the recent rains. Silas came hurrying from the barn at the sound of approaching horses, a shotgun cradled loosely in his arms, though Micah raised a hand to signal him to keep it lowered, not wanting to give Pratt any excuse to escalate matters. "Mrs. Wilcox." Pratt dismounted this time, his small eyes flicking between Maude and Micah with obvious calculation. "I trust you have gathered the $420 owed." "Mr. Pratt, I believe you are aware that your note failed to provide the legally required 30 days' notice before calling in the debt. My lawyer, Mr. Elias Thorne, has already filed objection with the territorial court and written directly to your bank's regional office regarding the matter." Pratt's mustache twitched, the first sign of genuine surprise Maude had seen from him. "I know nothing of any such filing." "Then perhaps you should check with your superiors before proceeding further, Mr. Pratt, before you find yourself the subject of legal action for wrongful eviction attempt." Sheriff Bragg, who had remained mounted throughout this exchange, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Pratt, if there is a legal question about the notice period, I cannot in good conscience assist with an eviction today. I would be opening myself up to liability. The bank's business is not concerned with your liability, Sheriff." Pratt's voice had grown sharp, though Maude noted with some satisfaction that his earlier confidence had cracked considerably. "My badge is concerned with my liability, Pratt, and I will not be part of an illegal seizure. If your paperwork is not in order, I suggest you return to Prescott and sort it out proper before coming back out here." It was Micah who spoke next, stepping forward with the same calm steadiness that had first drawn Maude to trust him. "Mr. Pratt, we have also raised $395 toward the debt regardless, in good faith, should the note prove valid after all. That leaves a balance of only $25, which Mrs. Wilcox is prepared to pay from the proceeds of her next cattle sale, with your bank's agreement to reasonable terms." Pratt looked between the assembled group, Maude with her chin lifted in that familiar posture of quiet defiance, Micah standing solid and unmoving beside her, Silas with his shotgun no longer quite so loosely held, and Sheriff Bragg clearly disinclined to support any further action that day. Whatever calculations ran behind his small eyes, he seemed to arrive at the conclusion that this was a fight not worth pressing further, at least not today. "I will return to Prescott and confirm the status of the notice period," Pratt said stiffly. "If the note is found valid, I will expect the balance paid promptly upon my return, along with appropriate interest for the delay." "That is fair enough, Mr. Pratt," Maude said. "And if the note is found invalid, I trust the bank will consider this matter closed, and perhaps reconsider its practice of calling in loans before their proper time." Pratt did not respond to this last remark, merely remounted his horse with as much dignity as he could muster and rode off back toward town, his 2 hired men and Sheriff Bragg following behind him. Maude watched them go, and felt, for the first time in weeks, that the ground beneath her feet had finally steadied. "That was well done," Micah said, once the riders had disappeared down the road. "I do not think he expected to be met with a lawyer's filing and a sheriff unwilling to bend to his will. I have you to thank for the money, and Thorne for the legal argument, and Silas for standing ready with that shotgun, even though I hope he never needs to use it." Maude turned to Silas, who was carefully setting the weapon aside now that the danger had passed. "Thank you, Silas, for everything these past 2 years and especially today." "Weren't nothing, ma'am. Man tries to take a widow's land out from under her when she's done nothing but work herself half to death keeping it going. Well, that's a man who deserves whatever comes to him." Silas gave Micah an approving nod. "Glad you were here too, Keene. Good to see the ranch might finally have a man around who knows what he's doing, present company excepted, of course." Micah laughed, a rich, warm sound that Maude found she wanted to hear more often. "I will take that as high praise, Silas." 3 weeks passed before word arrived from Prescott confirming what Thorne had suspected all along. The bank's early call on the note was indeed invalid due to the insufficient notice period, and the debt reverted to its original terms, due in full come October, by which time Maude's herd, fattened on the rains and the good grazing that followed, would easily fetch enough at market to settle the debt with room to spare. The $395 Micah and his friends had gathered was returned to each contributor with Maude's heartfelt thanks, save for the $85 from the cattle sale to Otis Faraday, which had been an outright transaction rather than a loan. With the immediate crisis resolved, Maude found herself with something she had not experienced in the 2 years since Thomas's death, a sense of settled security, and into that new stability, Micah Keene stepped with increasing regularity, riding out to the ranch 2 or 3 times a week, first under the pretense of checking on the fence repairs or offering advice on the herd, and later without pretense of any kind at all, simply because he wished to see her. Their courtship, once begun, moved with the particular blend of caution and eagerness that befit 2 people who had each already known love and loss, and who understood therefore both the preciousness of what they were building and the care it deserved. Micah brought her small gifts on his visits, a bolt of blue calico from Mrs. Abernathy's mercantile that matched, he said, the color of a certain autumn sky he had seen once and never forgotten, a jar of honey from a hive he had discovered on his own land, a book of poems he had ordered specially from a catalog out of Denver, because he had noticed her reading Thomas's old collection of Whitman on the porch one evening and thought she might enjoy something new. Maude, in turn, found herself baking extra portions of whatever she cooked, knowing Micah would likely arrive before supper, and finding a particular satisfaction in watching him eat with obvious enjoyment the meals she prepared. She began, too, to notice small things about him that she had not had occasion to observe in their earlier, more formal acquaintance. The way he hummed under his breath while mending tack, the gentle patience he showed with even the most stubborn of horses, the quiet grief that still crossed his face sometimes when he spoke of Sarah, grief that Maude recognized because she carried the same weight herself when she spoke of Thomas. "Do you think it's strange," she asked him one evening in early September, as they sat together on the porch watching the last light fade from the sky, "that we can love those who came before and still find room in our hearts for something new?" "I do not think it strange at all," Micah said, his arm settled comfortably around her shoulders. "I think it is the most natural thing in the world. Sarah would want me to be happy, same as I imagine Thomas would want the same for you. Love does not use up a fixed store, Maude. It grows more room the more it is given." "That is a fine way of putting it. I have had 4 years to think on it, while I waited for someone who might make me feel this way again. I did not expect it to be a widow with a struggling cattle ranch and a shotgun-toting foreman, but I suppose the heart does not always announce its plans in advance." Maude laughed, leaning into him. "I did not expect it to be a horse trader with a soft spot for autumn skies and old poetry, either, but I find I am glad of it." By the time October arrived and the debt was settled in full, paid from the proceeds of a healthy autumn cattle sale that saw Maude's herd fetch better prices than she had dared to hope, given how well they had fattened on the late-season grass, Micah had become so constant a presence at the Wilcox ranch that Silas had taken to setting an extra plate at supper without being asked, and the ranch hands had stopped remarking on his frequent visits, having long since accepted them as simply the way things were. It was on a crisp evening in late October, with the cottonwood trees along the creek bed turning gold and the first hint of true autumn chill in the air, that Micah asked Maude to marry him. They were standing by the creek itself, the same creek that had given the ranch its name, and that had nearly failed them both during the terrible drought of that summer, now running clear and full after the season's rains. "I have thought long on how to say this properly," Micah began, and Maude could see, in the fading light, a nervousness in him that she had not witnessed before, not even in the tense standoff with Pratt and Sheriff Bragg months earlier. "I have loved twice in my life, Maude. Once with Sarah, who I lost too soon, and now with you, who I hope with all my heart I will not lose at all, not for many long years to come. I do not have a grand speech prepared, only the truth of what is in my heart, which is that I want to build a life with you. I want to wake each morning knowing you are beside me, and I want to go to sleep each night having spent the day in your company, whether that day held hardship or joy, drought or plenty. Maude Wilcox, will you marry me?" Maude felt tears rise, unbidden but welcome, and found she could not speak for a long moment, so full was her heart with the answer she wished to give. When she finally found her voice, it came out steady and sure, despite the tears on her cheeks. "Yes, Micah Keene. Yes, I will marry you. I have known my answer for weeks now, I think, only waiting for you to ask the question." He kissed her then beneath the golden cottonwoods, with the creek running clear and full beside them, and Maude thought in that moment of how strange and wonderful life could be, that the same summer which had brought her to the edge of ruin, drought threatening her herd and a debt collector threatening her home, had also brought her to this, to a love she had not expected to find again, standing beside a man whose steady heart had proven itself in crisis and in quiet both. They were married in December, in the small church at Cottonwood Bend, with Silas walking Maude down the narrow aisle in the absence of any living family of her own, her parents having passed some years before and no siblings to speak of. Micah's own family, a widowed mother and a younger sister, traveled up from Tucson for the occasion, and Maude found in Micah's mother, a warm, sharp-witted woman named Constance Keene, something of the mother figure she had missed since her own mother's passing. Elias Thorne attended, along with Jedediah Snow and Otis Faraday, all three men who had helped raise the funds that first desperate week, and even Mrs. Abernathy from the Mercantile came, bringing a length of fine lace as a wedding gift, remarking that she had known, from the moment Maude first asked after Micah Keene at her shop, that something fine would come of it. The ceremony itself was simple, as fit the frontier means of the community, but no less heartfelt for its simplicity. The minister, a circuit riding preacher named Reverend Adams who came through Cottonwood Bend only once every few months, spoke of love that endured hardship, of partnership built not on ease but on the willingness to stand together through difficulty. And Maude found the words fitting well enough that she suspected Silas had spoken with the Reverend beforehand about the particulars of her and Micah's courtship. when Micah slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring he had commissioned specially from a jeweler in Prescott, using money saved from his livery business over the preceding months. Maude felt the full weight and wonder of the moment settle into her chest, a warmth that seemed to spread through her entire being. She had not expected, after Thomas's death, that she would ever again know this particular kind of joy. And yet here she stood, in the small church filled with friends and the beginnings of a new family, marrying a man whose steady presence had carried her through the darkest crisis of her adult life, and who now promised to carry her through whatever else the years might bring. They combined their two properties after the wedding, Micah selling off a portion of his own land but keeping the livery business, which he ran now with the help of a young man named Tobias, who had apprenticed under him for 2 years and proved himself capable of managing the day-to-day operations, freeing Micah to spend more of his time at the ranch alongside Maude and Silas. The combined herd grew steadily over the following seasons, and the ranch that had nearly been lost to drought and debt in the summer of 1883 flourished under their joint care, becoming, within a few short years, one of the most respected cattle operations in the county. In the spring of 1885, Maude gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas Micah Keene, honoring both Maude's late husband and his own father in the same breath, a gesture that Micah had suggested himself, understanding better than most the way love could hold space for those who came before without diminishing what came after. Thomas Micah, called Tommy by the family from his earliest days, grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's steady coffee-colored eyes. And by the time he was old enough to sit a horse, he had taken to trailing after Silas around the ranch, with an eagerness that reminded Maude powerfully of the early days of her own marriage to Thomas Wilcox, when she too had been young and eager to learn every corner of ranch life. 2 years after Tommy's birth, in the autumn of 1887, Maude gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Sarah Constance Keene, honoring Micah's first wife and his own mother in turn. Sarah Constance grew to be a bright, headstrong girl who showed an early fondness for horses that rivaled even her father's own skill, and who, by the age of 10, could be found more often than not in the barn helping Micah with the breeding stock, rather than in the kitchen learning household skills from her mother, a fact that amused Maude greatly, given her own history of running the ranch's practical operations rather than confining herself to more traditionally feminine pursuits. Silas remained with the family until his death in the winter of 1891, having grown old and content in his years, watching the ranch flourish under Maude and Micah's joint stewardship. He passed peacefully in his sleep, in the small cabin near the barn that had been his home for over a decade, and the whole family, along with much of the Cottonwood Bend community, gathered to mourn a man who had been, in every way that mattered, family to them all. Maude spoke at his funeral, recalling the shotgun he had held ready that tense day when Pratt and Sheriff Bragg had come to press the debt, and the fierce loyalty that had defined his years of service to her and to her late husband before that. The debt collector Wendell Pratt, for his part, never troubled the ranch again after that autumn day in 1883, having confirmed upon his return to Prescott that the note's early call had indeed been invalid due to the improper notice period. The Territorial Bank and Trust, facing Elias Thorne's continued pressure and the threat of further legal action, quietly settled the matter, and even, some years later, revised their standard note language to prevent similar disputes, a small victory that Thorne liked to remind Maude and Micah of whenever their paths crossed at community gatherings, taking evident pride in having helped correct what he considered a genuine injustice against small ranchers throughout the territory. An injustice that had squeezed many a hard-working family out of land they had earned through years of toil, simply because distant bank officials in Prescott cared more for their own profits than for the fairness of their dealings with the people who actually worked the land. Micah's livery business continued to thrive under Tobias's steady management, eventually expanding to include a small blacksmith operation that served much of the surrounding county, and the combined income from ranch and livery allowed the family a comfort that neither Maude nor Micah had known in their earlier, more precarious years. They built a new addition onto the original ranch house in 1889, adding 2 more bedrooms as their family grew, and Maude often reflected, standing on the porch of the home she had once feared losing entirely, on how strange and wonderful it was that the very crisis which had threatened to take everything from her had instead become the catalyst that brought her the deepest happiness of her life. In the spring of 1893, 10 years after that fateful summer when the drought had nearly broken the ranch and Pratt's visit had nearly finished the job, Maude and Micah stood together once more by the creek where he had proposed, now watching their 2 children, Tommy at 8 years old and Sarah Constance at 6, splash in the shallow water while a third child, born just that past winter and named William Silas Keene in honor of the foreman who had stood ready to defend the family when it mattered most, slept peacefully in a basket nearby, shaded from the sun by a wide-brimmed hat that Micah had placed carefully over the basket's edge. "Do you ever think back on that summer," Maude asked, watching the children play, "and wonder how different things might have turned out if you had not come to help me?" "I think on it often," Micah admitted, his arm settling around her shoulders in the same familiar gesture he had used a decade earlier, standing in nearly this same spot. "I think on how close I came to letting you walk out of my livery that first day, without saying half of what I wanted to say, out of some foolish notion that it was not proper to speak my feelings to a woman in the midst of her troubles. I am grateful every day that Silas had the good sense to send you to me, and that you had the courage to ask for help despite your pride. And I am grateful every day that you were the kind of man who answered that call not with charity that made me feel small, but with genuine partnership that let me keep my dignity even while accepting your help. That is no small thing, Micah. Many a man would have made me feel indebted to him in ways beyond the merely financial. I could never have loved you if you had let me treat you that way, Maude. Part of what drew me to you from the very start was that fierce independence, that refusal to be diminished by circumstance. I did not want to be your rescuer. I wanted to be your partner. There is a considerable difference, and I am glad you never let me forget it." Tommy called out from the creek bed, holding up a small fish he had managed to catch with his bare hands, his face bright with the particular pride of an 8-year-old boy who has accomplished something he considers remarkable. And Sarah Constance immediately demanded he release the fish back into the water, declaring with the absolute certainty of a 6-year-old that it was cruel to keep it out of the water so long. Micah laughed and called back some encouragement to both children, and Maude found herself laughing too, watching the easy, unguarded joy of her family gathered by the same creek that had given the ranch its name, and had nearly failed them both during that terrible drought so many years before. She thought, in that moment, of Thomas, of the man she had loved and lost, and found that the memory brought no pain now, only a quiet gratitude for the years they had shared and the ranch he had helped build, a foundation upon which she and Micah had constructed something even greater, a family and a life neither of them could have imagined possible in the depths of that desperate summer of 1883. She thought too of Sarah, Micah's first wife, whom she had never met but whom she had come to feel a strange kinship with, both of them women who had loved fiercely and lost too soon, both of them, perhaps, watching now with approval as their shared love found new life and new joy in the family Maude and Micah had built together. The ranch itself had grown considerably over the intervening decade, the herd now numbering in the hundreds rather than the modest 150 head Maude had struggled to maintain through that terrible drought. The original small house expanded twice now to accommodate their growing family, new barns and outbuildings constructed to handle the increased operations. They had weathered 2 more dry seasons in the years since, though neither had approached the severity of that first terrible drought, and they had weathered too the ordinary hardships of ranch life: sick cattle and broken fences, harsh winters, and the occasional conflict with neighboring outfits over grazing rights. But they had weathered all of it together, as true partners in every sense of the word, and Maude had come to understand that this partnership, this fundamental equality of respect and affection between them, was the true foundation upon which their happiness rested, more essential even than the financial security that had once seemed so precarious and now felt so solidly assured. As the afternoon light began to lengthen toward evening, Micah gathered up the sleeping baby William Silas from his basket, cradling the infant against his chest with the same gentle care he brought to every aspect of his life, and called the older children up from the creek to head back toward the house for supper. Maude walked beside him, her hand finding his free one as they walked, the same hand that had first taken hers on that cool September evening 10 years before, promising to find whatever money remained needed to save her ranch from the debt collector's threat. "I love you, Micah Keene," she said, as they walked together toward the house that had become, over the years, truly their home, rather than simply the ranch she had inherited from Thomas, transformed by their shared labor and shared love into something entirely new. "I love you too, Maude Wilcox Keene, more with each passing year, if such a thing is possible." "I believe it is," she said, smiling up at him as Tommy and Sarah Constance ran ahead of them toward the house, their laughter carrying back on the evening air. "I believe love only grows, given proper tending, the same as any good thing worth having in this life." They reached the house as the sun began its final descent toward the western hills, painting the sky once more in those brilliant shades of orange and violet that Maude had come to associate, over the years, with the particular happiness of her life with Micah, a happiness born from crisis but grown, through years of partnership and mutual devotion, into something as solid and enduring as the land itself. The ranch that had nearly been lost to drought and debt in that desperate summer of 1883 stood now as testament to what two people, determined and devoted, could build together against even the harshest circumstances the frontier could offer. A home filled with children's laughter and the deep abiding love of two hearts that had each known loss, and had chosen, despite that knowledge, to risk loving again. And in that home, through all the years that followed, that love only continued to grow, weathering whatever storms and droughts the territory might yet bring, secure in the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together, as they had faced that very first crisis so many years before, standing side by side against whatever the world might throw their way, bound not merely by the ranch they shared or the children they had raised together, but by a devotion that had proven itself, time and again, equal to whatever challenges life presented. The seasons continued to turn, as seasons always do, bringing new calves each spring and golden harvests each autumn, bringing, too, in the fullness of time, grandchildren to fill the ranch house with even more laughter and life than Maude and Micah could have imagined possible on that first desperate day when Wendell Pratt's wagon had rolled up the dusty road threatening everything Maude held dear. Tommy grew to manhood on that same land, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day management of the herd as Micah's own hands grew less steady with age, while Sarah Constance, true to her early fondness for horses, established her own small breeding operation on a parcel of the family land, becoming known throughout the territory for producing some of the finest saddle horses in the region. William Silas, the youngest, showed an early aptitude for numbers, and eventually took over the business side of the family's expanding operations, ensuring that the hard lessons learned from that near-disastrous encounter with the Territorial Bank and Trust were never repeated, keeping meticulous records and maintaining relationships with more honest and reasonable banking institutions in Prescott and beyond. Maude and Micah grew old together on that ranch, watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own, watching the small settlement of Cottonwood Bend grow too, from a modest collection of buildings strung along a single dusty street into a proper town with its own school, and a second church, and eventually even a small newspaper that Maude herself contributed occasional pieces to, writing about ranch life and the particular challenges and joys of raising a family on the frontier. They remained, throughout all those years, as devoted to each other as they had been on that first evening when Micah had kissed her by the water trough, their love having deepened and matured, but never having lost that essential warmth and mutual respect that had first drawn them together in the midst of crisis. In the final accounting, the story of that terrible summer of 1883, when drought had nearly broken Maude Wilcox's spirit and Wendell Pratt's debt collection visit had nearly broken her ranch entirely, became, in the retelling that happened often around the family dinner table in later years, not primarily a story of hardship and near ruin, but rather the story of how two people, each carrying the weight of previous loss, had found in each other a partnership strong enough to weather any storm the frontier might offer. It became, in short, a love story, the kind that Maude and Micah's own grandchildren would beg to hear again and again on quiet evenings, sitting by the fire in the same ranch house that had nearly been lost, but instead had become the foundation for generations of a family built on love, resilience, and the particular kind of devotion that only comes from choosing, again and again, to stand beside someone through whatever hardship life presents. Maude Wilcox Keene lived to see her 90th year, passing peacefully in the same ranch house she had fought so hard to save, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren who had gathered to celebrate what would prove to be her final birthday. Micah had preceded her in death by only 3 years, their long partnership finally ended by the ordinary passage of time rather than any dramatic crisis. And Maude had spoken often, in those final years of her life, of her gratitude for the decades of love and partnership they had shared, a gratitude that traced its origin back always to that desperate summer when a debt collector's visit had nearly taken everything, and a horse trader's kindness had given her instead a lifetime of happiness she had never dared to hope for in the depths of that crisis. The ranch itself continued on for generations after, passed down through the family line, the creek that had given it its original name still running through the property, sometimes swollen with spring rains and sometimes reduced during dry summers to the same trickle that had once threatened Maude's herd, but never again allowed to bring the kind of desperate crisis that had marked that first terrible drought, the family having learned, through Maude and Micah's example, the value of preparation and partnership in facing whatever challenges the frontier might present. And in the town of Cottonwood Bend, the story of the widow who had saved her ranch and found love in the doing of it was told and retold for generations, a small but treasured piece of the larger history of a territory that had demanded much of those who sought to build lives upon its harsh and beautiful land, but that had also, for those willing to work and to love with equal devotion, offered rewards beyond anything mere survival might suggest. Rewards measured not in cattle or acreage, but in the deep and abiding happiness of a life well and truly shared.